At the family meeting, my daughter-in-law called me poor, I said, and even now, I can still hear the way the room went quiet right after, not because anyone was shocked, but because no one felt the need to correct her. The words hung in the air like they belonged there, like I had been reduced to that single description long before I ever realized it. I remember smoothing the front of my navy dress, the one I had picked out that morning with more care than I wanted to admit, thinking it was important to look presentable, to look like I still belonged in that house, at that table, in that family. The dining room was exactly as it had always been, polished wood table, 8 chairs, the faint scent of lemon cleaner still lingering, but something about it felt different, colder, like I was sitting in a place that had already decided I was no longer welcome. Vanessa sat across from me, perfectly composed, her blonde hair pulled back in that effortless way that always seemed intentional, her smile polite but empty. She had a way of speaking that sounded reasonable to anyone who didn't know her. A softness that disguised the sharp edges underneath. "We're just being realistic," she had said moments earlier, folding her hands on the table as if she were presenting a business proposal instead of dismantling someone's dignity. "This family has certain financial standards." I noticed how Daniel didn't look at me when she said it. My son, who used to reach for my hand when he was scared of thunderstorms, now kept his eyes fixed on the table, as if the grain of the wood was more important than the woman who raised him. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I simply glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the time with quiet precision, as though it mattered for something far beyond that conversation. Vanessa continued speaking, explaining budgets, investments, future plans, all the things that apparently didn't include me anymore. There was a subtle shift in how she referred to the house, to the assets, to everything that had once been shared. It was no longer ours. It was theirs. And I was something outside of that circle, something temporary, something inconvenient. I nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, the kind you give when you finally understand something you've been trying not to see. The others at the table avoided eye contact, their silence more telling than any words they could have spoken. I could feel the weight of every small moment leading up to this one, every time I had been left out of a decision, every time a conversation stopped when I entered the room, every polite smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. It hadn't happened all at once. It never does. It happens slowly, quietly, until one day someone says it out loud, and suddenly there's no pretending anymore. Vanessa leaned back slightly, satisfied, as if she had clarified something that needed to be said. "We just think it's best if everyone contributes equally," she added, her tone still calm, still measured. I met her gaze for the first time then, really looked at her, and for a brief second I saw it clearly, not just the ambition, not just the calculation, but the certainty that she believed she had already won. That was the part that almost made me smile. Not out of amusement but out of recognition. Because certainty, I've learned, is often the first mistake people make when they underestimate someone who has been quiet for too long. I rested my hands in my lap, steady, composed, giving nothing away. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, but inside me something had shifted. Something that wasn't anger, wasn't even sadness, but something colder, clearer. I had spent years being patient, being understanding, being the one who made things easier for everyone else. And now, sitting there, listening to my worth being reduced to a number that didn't meet their expectations, I realized something simple. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. And that misunderstanding was about to cost them more than they could possibly imagine. I did not stay long after that conversation ended, not because I felt unwelcome, but because I understood that everything I needed to see had already been revealed, and there was no value in sitting there any longer pretending that we were still a family in the way I had always believed we were. I excused myself quietly, offering the same polite tone I had used for decades, the same tone that had carried me through countless dinners, holidays, and difficult moments. But this time it felt different, lighter somehow, as if I had set something down without realizing I had been carrying it for years. No one stopped me as I stood up, no one asked where I was going, and that, more than anything, confirmed what I had already begun to accept. I walked down the hallway slowly, my heels making a soft, steady sound against the hardwood floor, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. The house was familiar in every detail, the framed photos lining the walls, the soft lighting in the corners, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but it no longer felt like mine. It felt like a place I had once belonged to, a place I had invested time, care, and love into, but one that had quietly moved on without me. I paused for a moment near the front door, glancing at a photograph of Daniel as a young boy. His arm wrapped tightly around me, his smile wide and unguarded, a memory of a time when I was not an afterthought, when I was not measured against financial expectations or reduced to a liability in a conversation that sounded more like a boardroom discussion than a family gathering. I reached out and adjusted the frame slightly, straightening it even though it did not need to be straightened, a habit I had developed over the years, fixing small things when larger ones felt beyond repair. Outside, the late afternoon air was cool, the sky beginning to shift into that soft golden color that comes just before sunset, and I took a slow breath as I stepped onto the driveway, allowing the quiet to settle around me. I could still hear faint voices from inside the house, Vanessa continuing her explanation, Daniel responding in low tones, the rhythm of a conversation that no longer included me. I walked a few steps away from the house and then stopped, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be certain of something. I glanced down at my watch again, confirming the time with the same calm precision I had shown earlier, and then I simply waited. It was not a long wait, but it was enough to let the moment settle, enough to feel the shift from what had been to what was about to be. For years I had been patient, believing that understanding and kindness would be enough to hold everything together, that if I gave enough, supported enough, adjusted enough, things would remain stable. But stability, I had come to realize, is often built on assumptions, and assumptions can be quietly rewritten by those who benefit from them. A faint sound began to build in the distance, low at first, almost easy to ignore if you were not paying attention, but I was paying attention now in a way I had not been before. I lifted my gaze toward the horizon, my posture relaxed, my expression unchanged, as the sound grew stronger, more defined, no longer something that could be dismissed as background noise. Inside the house I could sense a shift even without seeing it, a pause in conversation, a subtle break in the rhythm, the kind of interruption that makes people look up, makes them wonder what is happening just beyond their line of sight. I did not turn back immediately. I let the moment unfold, let the sound become unmistakable, let it fill the space that had, moments earlier, been occupied by quiet dismissal and casual judgment. There is a difference between reacting and responding, and I had spent enough time learning that difference to know which one mattered. When I finally turned, it was not with urgency, not with excitement, but with a calm that came from knowing exactly what I was doing and why. The house stood behind me, unchanged in appearance but entirely different in meaning, and as the sound overhead grew louder, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not because I needed to prove anything, but because for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer being defined by the way others chose to see me. I was about to show them something they had never thought to question, something they had dismissed without ever truly understanding, and I knew with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that whatever happened next would not be a surprise to me, only to them. The sound grew louder until it could no longer be ignored, the steady rhythm of blades cutting through the air, turning heads both inside the house and along the quiet street, and I watched as the front door opened behind me, first slowly, then with a kind of urgency that had not been there before, Daniel stepping out onto the porch with a confused expression, followed closely by Vanessa. Her composure no longer as effortless as it had been just minutes earlier. They both looked up instinctively, their eyes scanning the sky as the helicopter descended with controlled precision toward the open space at the far end of the property, the wind beginning to stir the trees, lifting strands of Vanessa's perfectly arranged hair, disrupting the stillness that had once belonged entirely to them. I remained where I was, my posture unchanged, my hands resting calmly at my sides, as if this were simply another expected moment in an ordinary day. Daniel took a few steps forward, his gaze shifting between the aircraft and me, trying to connect something that did not yet make sense in his mind. Vanessa, on the other hand, said nothing at first, her eyes narrowing slightly, her instincts sharper, more alert, as if she could feel that something about this moment was not aligning with the version of reality she had constructed. The helicopter touched down smoothly, the engine still humming as the door opened and a man stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that contrasted with the mechanical presence behind him, his movements efficient, purposeful, as he walked directly toward me without hesitation. He did not look at Daniel or Vanessa, did not acknowledge their presence because to him, they were not the ones he had come to see. He stopped a few feet away from me and gave a small, respectful nod. "Mrs. Collins," he said clearly, his voice steady even against the fading noise of the blades. "Everything is prepared exactly as you requested." I inclined my head slightly in return, acknowledging him with the same quiet composure I had maintained all afternoon, and for a moment, there was a silence that felt entirely different from the one inside the house, this one not filled with dismissal, but with realization. Daniel's expression shifted first, confusion giving way to something deeper, something unsettled as he looked at the man, then back at me, as if seeing me for the first time in a way he had not allowed himself to before. "Mom," he said, his voice uncertain, almost cautious. "What is going on?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I took a small step forward, closing the distance between myself and the man who had arrived, and accepted the folder he extended toward me. The weight of it in my hands was familiar not because of what it was, but because of what it represented: years of decisions made quietly, carefully, without the need for announcement or approval. Vanessa finally spoke then, her tone controlled but edged with something that had not been there earlier, something closer to urgency. "Margaret, what is this?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the folder, on the man, on anything that might explain what she was seeing. I turned slightly, just enough to meet her gaze, and for the first time that day, I allowed a hint of something to show, not anger, not satisfaction, but clarity. "This," I said calmly, "is what you never thought to ask about." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that shifted the atmosphere completely. The man beside me remained silent, his presence steady, professional, as if he had witnessed moments like this before, moments where assumptions unraveled in real time. Daniel took another step closer, his attention now fully on me, the distance between us no longer just physical, but something that had been built over years and was only now being acknowledged. "I do not understand," he said, and there was something in his voice that reminded me, faintly, of the boy he used to be, the one who asked questions without fear. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for the silence to settle again. But this time it was different, heavier, filled with the unspoken realization that the conversation from earlier had not ended, it had only shifted locations. I opened the folder slowly, not for dramatic effect, but because there was no need to rush, and glanced at the documents inside, confirming what I already knew. Then I closed it again, keeping it in my hands, and looked back at both of them, my expression composed, my voice steady. "You spent a long time deciding what I was worth," I said, each word measured, deliberate, "without ever asking what I actually have." The air between us felt different now, no longer defined by their assumptions, but by the quiet unveiling of something they had overlooked entirely, and as the last echoes of the helicopter faded into the distance, I could see it clearly, not just in their faces, but in the way they stood, the way they looked at me, that the certainty they had carried so confidently before was beginning to slip, replaced by something far less comfortable, something they were not prepared to face. Vanessa did not speak immediately after that, and the silence that followed was no longer one that worked in her favor. It stretched too long, too exposed, leaving no room for her usual control to reassert itself. I could see the shift in her posture, subtle but unmistakable, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her gaze flickered briefly toward Daniel as if searching for reassurance that no longer seemed guaranteed. For years she had been the one guiding every conversation, shaping every decision, positioning herself at the center of everything that mattered. And now for the first time she was standing in a moment she had not prepared for. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, his eyes moving again between me and the man beside me, trying to piece together a version of reality that made sense. "Mom," he said again, more firmly this time. "What is all of this?" There was no accusation in his voice, not yet, only confusion, but confusion has a way of turning into something else when it is left unanswered for too long. I considered him for a moment, not as the man standing in front of me, but as the boy I had raised, the one who used to believe that I always had the answers. The truth was I had always had them, I had just chosen not to use them. I shifted the folder slightly in my hands, feeling the edges of the documents inside, each one representing a decision made quietly, deliberately, without the need for recognition. "It is everything you chose not to see," I said calmly, my voice even, not raised, not sharpened, just clear. Vanessa let out a short, controlled breath, a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been held back at the last second. "Margaret," she said, forcing her tone back into something measured, something closer to what she was used to. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding, we can talk about it inside." The suggestion was almost polite, but it carried an urgency that had not been there before, as if bringing the conversation back into the house might somehow restore the balance she had lost. I did not move. I did not take a single step toward the door. No, I replied simply, and that one word seemed to land heavier than anything else I had said. The man beside me remained still, his presence unobtrusive but firm, as though he understood that this moment belonged entirely to me. The air around us had shifted again, the earlier tension now replaced by something quieter, more precise, like the calm that comes when everything unnecessary has already fallen away. I opened the folder once more, this time turning it slightly so that both Daniel and Vanessa could see the top document, not close enough for them to read every detail, but enough for them to recognize the structure, the official formatting, the signatures that carried weight. I watched their expressions carefully, not for reaction but for understanding. Vanessa's eyes moved quickly, scanning, calculating, trying to identify what she was looking at before it could fully register, while Daniel's gaze lingered longer, his brow tightening as recognition began to form. "This is not possible," Vanessa said quietly, almost to herself, though the words were meant to reach me. I closed the folder again with the same measured motion, as if the act itself required no emphasis, because the truth inside it would speak louder than any gesture. "It has always been possible," I said, meeting her gaze directly. "You just never asked the right questions." The words were not meant to provoke, only to clarify, and that was what made them difficult to dismiss. Daniel took another step forward, closer now than he had been all afternoon, his attention no longer divided, no longer distant. "Are you saying?" he began, then stopped, as if the conclusion he was reaching did not align with everything he had assumed for so long. I waited, giving him the space to finish the thought on his own, because some realizations cannot be handed to someone, they have to be reached. He looked at me then, really looked, not at the version of me he had grown accustomed to, but at the person standing in front of him now, and something in his expression shifted, not fully, not completely, but enough to suggest that the certainty he had relied on was beginning to unravel. Vanessa, however, was not ready to let go of hers. "This does not change anything," she said, her voice firmer now, her composure returning in small, deliberate pieces. "We were discussing responsibilities, contributions, what is fair for everyone involved." I held her gaze without interruption, allowing her to finish because fairness, I had learned, is often defined by those who benefit from it the most. When she stopped, I spoke again, my tone unchanged, my words steady. "You were discussing what you believed I was worth," I said, "without understanding what I have already given." There was a difference between those two things, a difference that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The late afternoon light had begun to fade, casting longer shadows across the driveway, and in that shifting light everything seemed clearer, not because anything had changed in the physical sense, but because the assumptions that had once defined this space were no longer holding together. I stood there, composed, unhurried, knowing that this moment was not about proving anything. It was about allowing the truth to exist without being interrupted, without being reshaped to fit someone else's expectations. And for the first time since I had stepped into that house earlier that day, I felt something settle into place, not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the balance had already shifted, and there was nothing left for me to question. Daniel did not speak for several seconds after that, and in those seconds I could see something unfolding behind his eyes, not a sudden realization, but the slow, uncomfortable process of revisiting everything he had accepted without question, every conversation, every decision that had quietly excluded me while he convinced himself it was reasonable. He looked down briefly, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person, the mother he had known and the one standing in front of him now, calm, composed, and no longer asking for permission to be understood. "Why did you not say anything?" he finally asked, his voice lower now, less certain, and there was something almost fragile in the way he said it, as if the answer mattered more than he expected. I held his gaze without hesitation, because the answer had never been complicated. "Because I was waiting," I said, my tone even, "to see how far you would go without asking." The words settled between us, not sharp, not accusatory, but undeniable in their meaning. Vanessa shifted beside him, her expression tightening again, her control slipping, in small but noticeable ways. "This is not fair," she said quickly, her voice carrying a trace of frustration now. "You are turning this into something it is not." We were trying to make responsible decisions for the future. I listened without interrupting, allowing her to finish, because I had heard variations of that explanation before, always framed as practicality, always presented as something necessary, something justified. When she stopped, I nodded slightly, acknowledging the effort she was making to regain control of the narrative. You were making decisions, I said calmly, but not with all the information. That distinction mattered more than anything else, and I could see from the way her eyes narrowed that she understood it, even if she was not ready to admit it. The man beside me took a small step forward then, not intruding, but positioning himself just enough to signal that there was more to be said, more that had already been prepared. Mrs. Collins, he said respectfully, would you like me to proceed? His question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. I gave a slight nod, and he opened a second folder he had been holding, removing a document and holding it in a way that made its significance clear without the need for explanation. Daniel's attention shifted immediately, his focus drawn to the paper, to the official seals, to the structure he recognized but did not yet fully understand. This is the current ownership and control structure for Collins Holdings, the man said, his voice steady, professional, each word measured with care. As of 6 years ago, all primary assets, including the property, the investment accounts and the operating entities, were consolidated under a single trust. He paused briefly, allowing the information to settle, then continued. The sole controlling authority of that trust is Mrs. Margaret Collins. The silence that followed was not the same as before. This one carried weight, consequence, something that could not be dismissed or explained away with polite language. Daniel's expression changed completely, the confusion replaced by something sharper, something closer to realization, as he looked at me again, this time with a clarity that had been missing all day. You own all of it? He asked, the question coming out slower than he intended, as if the words themselves required adjustment. I did not respond immediately, not because I was hesitating, but because the answer was already clear in everything that had just been said. Vanessa, however, reacted differently. That does not make sense, she said quickly, her voice rising slightly despite her effort to control it. Daniel has been managing everything for years. We have been handling the finances, the investments, the planning. Her words came faster now, as if speaking them quickly might make them more solid, more defensible. The man glanced at her briefly, then back at me, waiting, allowing me to decide how much needed to be clarified. I met Vanessa's gaze again, not with confrontation, but with a steady calm that left no room for misinterpretation. You have been managing what I allowed you to manage, I said quietly, and that quietness seemed to carry more weight than any raised voice ever could. Daniel took a step back then, the shift in his posture immediate, as if the ground beneath him had changed in a way he could not ignore. All this time, he murmured more to himself than to anyone else, and I could see the realization taking shape, not just about the assets but about the role he had played, the assumptions he had accepted, the way he had allowed someone else to define the value of the person who had built everything long before he ever stepped into it. The late light had faded further now, the sky deepening into a cooler shade, and the house behind them seemed different, not because it had changed, but because the understanding of who it truly belonged to had finally come into focus. I stood there, still composed, not needing to emphasize anything further, because the truth had a way of settling on its own when there was nothing left to obscure it, and in that moment, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by assumptions anymore, but by something far more difficult to ignore. Vanessa's composure did not return this time, not fully, and I could see it in the small details she could no longer control, the way her fingers tightened slightly around her arm, the way her eyes moved too quickly between the documents and my face, searching for something that would allow her to reframe what was happening into something manageable. But there are moments that cannot be reshaped once they have been fully revealed, and this was one of them. Daniel stood very still now, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a kind of quiet shock that had not yet found its way into words, and I watched as he slowly began to understand not just the structure of what had been said, but the implication behind it, the years of decisions, the layers of trust he had assumed were his to navigate when in truth, they had always rested somewhere else entirely. Why did you let us think? He started, then stopped, his voice trailing off as if the question itself was too large to finish. I did not step closer, did not reach out, because this was not a moment that required comfort, it required clarity. Because you never asked, I said simply, and there was no accusation in it, only fact, only the quiet truth that questions left unspoken often lead to answers that are never understood. Vanessa let out a sharp breath, her patience thinning in a way she could no longer disguise. This is unnecessary, she said, her tone tighter now, less controlled. We have been running everything efficiently. There has been no issue, no loss, no reason to make this into a problem. I turned my attention to her fully then, not with irritation, not with confrontation, but with a level stillness that made her words feel smaller than she intended them to be. There has been a misunderstanding, I replied. And misunderstandings become problems when they are allowed to continue. The man beside me remained silent, his role not to argue, not to persuade, but to present what had already been decided long before this afternoon. He adjusted the document slightly, as if preparing for the next step, and I knew he was waiting for my signal. The air had cooled further, the evening settling in, and with it came a sense of finality that did not need to be announced. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, more measured, as if he were choosing each word carefully. What happens now? He asked, and this time there was no assumption in his tone. No expectation that the answer would favor him, only a genuine need to understand. I held his gaze for a moment before responding, allowing the weight of the question to exist fully before offering anything in return. Now, I said calmly, we correct what has been assumed. Vanessa shook her head slightly, a faint, disbelieving motion that suggested she was still searching for a way to regain control of the situation. You cannot just change everything overnight, she said, her voice steadier than before but carrying an edge that had not been there earlier. There are plans, commitments, responsibilities that depend on how things have been structured. I listened without interruption, then gave a small nod, acknowledging that she believed what she was saying. That is exactly why this was done carefully, I replied, and I gestured lightly toward the man beside me, who stepped forward just enough to speak again. All operational authority has been adjusted in accordance with the controlling trust, he said, his tone clear, professional, effective immediately. All financial decisions, asset allocations, and property management will require direct approval from Mrs. Collins. The words were precise, leaving no room for interpretation, and I watched as they settled into place, not just in their meaning, but in their consequence. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance of something he could no longer deny, while Vanessa's expression tightened once more, the realization beginning to take hold that this was not a conversation she could redirect or negotiate in the way she was accustomed to. So you are taking everything back, she said, her voice quieter now, but sharper, more focused, as if narrowing the situation down might make it easier to confront. I met her gaze without hesitation. I am taking responsibility, I said, and the distinction between those two things hung clearly in the space between us. There was a difference between losing control and never having had it in the first place, and that difference was finally becoming impossible to ignore. The evening had fully settled now, the last light fading from the sky, and the house behind them stood silent, no longer the center of the moment, but simply a structure that would now exist under a different understanding. I stood where I was, composed, unhurried, knowing that this was not about taking something away, it was about restoring something that had never truly been given. And in that quiet realization, I could see it clearly in both of them, the moment when certainty gives way to truth, and there is no path back to what once felt unquestioned. Vanessa's eyes did not leave my face, but I could see the calculation behind them beginning to fracture, not because she had run out of arguments, but because she was starting to realize that none of them applied in the way she had assumed they would. Control, I had learned, is often built on patterns, on predictable reactions, on knowing how someone will respond before they even speak, and what unsettles people the most is not resistance but the absence of it. I had not raised my voice, had not interrupted, had not defended myself in the way she expected, and now there was nothing familiar left for her to hold on to. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, as if he were standing in a place that no longer felt stable beneath him. He looked at the house behind him, then back at me, and I followed his gaze for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for him to understand what he was seeing. It was still the same house, the same walls, the same windows, the same carefully maintained exterior, but meaning has a way of changing when the truth behind it is revealed. So everything we planned, he said slowly, his voice quieter than before. It does not go forward the way we thought. It was not a question this time but a statement, one that carried the weight of acceptance rather than confusion. I inclined my head slightly, not in agreement with the loss, but with the clarity of his understanding. Plans are only stable when they are built on accurate information, I replied, my tone calm, measured, leaving no room for interpretation. Vanessa stepped forward then, closing the distance slightly, her movement more deliberate now, as if proximity might restore some level of influence. We have commitments, she said, her voice steady but tighter than before. Contracts, timelines, people depending on us. You cannot just step in and change everything without consequences. I listened carefully because what she was saying was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. There are always consequences, I said. The question is whether they are managed or ignored. The distinction settled between us and for a moment no one spoke. The man beside me adjusted his stance slightly, ready, attentive, as though he understood that this was the point where decisions would begin to take shape beyond words. I turned to him briefly, giving a small nod, and he responded without hesitation. All pending transactions have been placed under review, he said clearly. Any agreements that have not been finalized will require reassessment under the updated authority structure. Existing obligations will be honored where appropriate, but only with direct approval moving forward. His words were precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and I watched as they landed, not just as information, but as reality. Daniel's shoulders lowered further, his earlier tension giving way to something quieter, more reflective, as if he were beginning to see not just the outcome, but the path that had led here. Vanessa, however, held her ground, her expression firm, though the certainty behind it was no longer as solid as it had been at the start of the afternoon. You are dismantling everything we built, she said, her voice controlled, but carrying an edge that suggested she was holding on to the last version of control she believed she still had. I met her gaze steadily without interruption, allowing her words to settle before responding. No, I said quietly. I am clarifying what was built and who built it. The difference was not dramatic, but it was absolute, and I could see from the way her expression tightened that she understood it, even if she did not accept it. The evening air had grown cooler, the light almost entirely gone now, and the soft hum of the helicopter behind us had faded into a distant presence. No longer the center of attention, but a reminder of how quickly things can shift when assumptions are challenged. Daniel looked at me again, his expression no longer guarded, but searching, as if he were trying to understand not just what had changed, but why it had taken this long for him to see it. You trusted me, he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was not sure if that trust still existed. I considered him for a moment, not as the man standing in front of me, but as the years that had led to this point. I gave you responsibility, I said, my tone steady. Trust is what you choose to do with it. The words were not harsh, but they were final in a way that left little room for reinterpretation. Vanessa's gaze shifted briefly to Daniel, then back to me, as if measuring the distance between what she believed she had secured and what was now slipping beyond her reach. The space between us felt different now. Not tense, not confrontational, but resolved, as if something that had been unsettled for a long time had finally found its place. I stood there, composed, unhurried, knowing that this was not about taking something away or proving a point, but about allowing the truth to exist without being reshaped, and in that quiet certainty, I could see it clearly in both of them, the moment when control is no longer assumed, but questioned, and once that question is asked, it can never be undone. The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was no longer neutral, it carried a weight that had not been there before. A kind of stillness that forces people to confront what they would rather avoid. Vanessa was the first to break it, though not with words at first, but with a small shift in her stance, the kind that reveals more than it intends to, her confidence no longer rooted in certainty, but in resistance. So what now? She said finally, her voice controlled but thinner than before. We just step aside and let you take over everything as if none of the work we have done matters. I watched her carefully, not with judgment but with recognition, because I understood that what she was holding onto was not just control, but identity, the belief that her position had been earned in a way that could not be questioned. Work matters, I said calmly. but ownership determines direction. The distinction settled between us, and this time she did not respond immediately. Daniel remained quiet, his attention fixed somewhere between the ground and the documents in my hand, as if he were still piecing together how something so foundational could have been misunderstood for so long. The man beside me stepped back slightly, giving the moment space, his role now less about presenting and more about witnessing, as the implications continued to unfold without interruption. We made decisions based on what we believed was right, Daniel said after a moment, his voice steady but subdued, no longer defensive, but searching for footing in a reality that had shifted beneath him. I nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that, because belief is often sincere even when it is incomplete. And now you have more information, I replied, which means your decisions can change. Vanessa's gaze sharpened slightly at that, as if the suggestion itself was something she was not prepared to accept. Or maybe the decisions do not belong to us anymore, she said, her tone quieter now, but edged with something more focused, more direct. I held her gaze without hesitation. They belong where they have always belonged, I said, and I did not need to elaborate further, because the meaning was already clear. The evening had settled fully now, the last traces of daylight replaced by a soft, dim glow from the exterior lights of the house, casting long shadows across the driveway. In that light, everything felt more defined, more precise, as if the lack of distraction allowed the truth to stand on its own without embellishment. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but noticeable, and when he looked up again, there was something different in his expression, not agreement, not yet, but an awareness that had not been there before. If this is how it is, he said carefully, then what do you expect from us? It was a different kind of question, one that did not assume control but sought direction, and I considered it for a moment before answering. I expect clarity, I said, my voice even, in what you choose to do next. Vanessa let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though it carried no humor. Clarity does not change the fact that everything we planned has to be reconsidered, she said, and this time there was less resistance in her tone, more recognition of the situation as it actually was. No, I replied, but it allows you to decide whether those plans still align with reality. The difference between those two things was subtle but significant, and I could see from the way she looked at me that she understood it, even if she did not welcome it. The man beside me glanced briefly toward the helicopter, then back to me, a silent reminder that everything was in place, that this moment, however long it lasted, was not indefinite. I shifted the folder in my hands, not opening it again, because there was no need to repeat what had already been made clear. There will be time to review everything, I said, my tone steady, but not under the assumptions that brought us here. Daniel nodded slowly, the movement small but deliberate, as if he were accepting something he could not change, even if he did not yet fully understand how to move forward from it. Vanessa remained still, her posture composed once more, though no longer anchored in certainty, but in a kind of quiet calculation that suggested she was already beginning to adapt, to reassess, to consider what this new structure meant for her place within it. I looked at both of them for a moment longer, not searching for a response, not waiting for agreement, but simply acknowledging the shift that had taken place, the point at which something unspoken had finally been brought into the open. This was never about taking something from you, I said, my voice calm, measured. It was about making sure it was never taken from me. The words settled into the space between us, not as a conclusion, but as a foundation, something that would remain long after this moment had passed. And in that quiet I could see it clearly, not just in their expressions, but in the way they stood, in the way they looked at me now, that whatever came next would not be shaped by assumption or convenience, but by something far more difficult to ignore, something that could not be undone once it had been seen. I did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because silence, when it is no longer used to avoid truth, becomes something else entirely. It becomes space, space for people to confront what they have just heard without the comfort of interruption. Daniel stood there, his posture no longer defensive, no longer distant, but uncertain in a way that suggested he was beginning to understand not just the situation, but his place within it, and how easily that place had been shaped by someone else's certainty. Vanessa, on the other hand, remained composed on the surface, but I could see the adjustment happening beneath it, the careful recalibration of someone who had built her position on control and was now faced with a structure that did not respond to it in the same way. The house behind them was quiet, the lights steady, the windows reflecting nothing but the dim glow of the evening, and for the first time it felt like exactly what it was, a property, not a symbol, not a center of power, but something defined by ownership rather than assumption. I let my gaze move from one to the other, not searching for agreement, not expecting apology, but simply acknowledging that this moment, whether they accepted it or not, had already changed everything that came after it. You will have access to everything you need to review, I said calmly, my voice even, because clarity once established does not require emphasis, but decisions will no longer be made without full understanding. Daniel nodded slowly, the movement quiet but genuine, as if he were accepting a responsibility he had not fully recognized before, not as something granted, but as something that required awareness, something that could not be assumed again. Vanessa did not nod, but she did not argue either, and that in itself was a shift, a subtle but significant one, the absence of resistance where there had once been certainty. The man beside me closed his folder with a soft, deliberate motion, signaling without words that everything that needed to be presented had already been made clear, and that what remained now was not explanation but consequence. I took a small step back, not away from them, but away from the center of the moment, as if to allow it to settle fully without my presence anchoring it any further. There will be a meeting scheduled, I continued. A proper one with full documentation, full transparency, and no assumptions. The distinction mattered not because it changed what had already happened, but because it ensured that what came next would not follow the same pattern. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, and for a brief moment, I saw something familiar in his expression, not the certainty he had carried before, but something quieter, something closer to respect, though it was still forming, still uncertain in its place. I understand, he said, and this time, the words did not sound like an attempt to regain control, but an acknowledgement that control had never been what he thought it was. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to suggest that she had accepted, at least for now, that the conversation had moved beyond her ability to redirect it. We will review everything, she said, her tone steady again, but different, less authoritative, more measured, as if she were choosing her words with a new awareness of how they might be received. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without confirming it, because understanding is not proven in words, but in what follows them. The night had settled completely now, the air cooler, the quiet deeper, and the moment that had begun inside that dining room had fully unfolded into something neither of them had expected, something that could not be undone by returning inside or resuming a conversation where it had left off. I turned slightly toward the helicopter, the soft hum of its presence still there, steady, waiting, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel the simplicity of what had just happened, not as a victory, not as a loss, but as a correction, something that had been necessary long before it was acknowledged. I did not say anything more because there was nothing left that required explanation, nothing that needed to be emphasized or repeated. Instead, I took a step forward, then another, moving with the same calm precision I had carried throughout the entire day, not looking back immediately, not because I was avoiding anything but because I no longer needed to. Behind me, I could feel their presence, the shift in their understanding, the quiet realization that the person they had underestimated had never been what they assumed. And just before I reached the helicopter, I paused, not turning fully, but enough to let my voice carry back to them, steady, clear, without force. You confuse silence with weakness, I said, and then I continued forward, leaving the rest unspoken, because the truth once seen does not need to be repeated.